My name is Dorothy Calloway, and I am 67 years old. I have lived long enough to know that the moments that break you are rarely the loud ones. They are not the slammed doors or the shouted words. They are the quiet ones. The ones that arrive softly, almost politely, like a guest you didn't expect, and then stay forever. This particular moment arrived on a Saturday evening in April of 2025, in a house I helped pay for, in a neighborhood I helped my son choose, standing in a kitchen that smelled like catered food and someone else's perfume. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where everything worth understanding always starts. At the beginning. I raised Marcus alone. I want you to sit with that for a moment before I say anything else, because I think people hear that sentence and nod too quickly, without really feeling the weight of it. Lone. Not with a difficult partner. Not with an absent one. Lone. His father, Gerald, left when Marcus was 4 years old and I was 31, and he took with him whatever romantic notions I still had about being rescued. I was a home health aide in Columbus, Ohio. I worked 6 days a week for most of Marcus's childhood. I took the early bus, the one that ran at 5:15 in the morning when the streets were still dark and the air still had that sharp Midwestern cold to it that bites right through your coat. I sat with elderly patients who couldn't bathe themselves, who couldn't remember what year it was, who sometimes called me by names that weren't mine. And I held their hands anyway. I came home tired in ways that sleep couldn't always fix. But I came home. Marcus was a serious child. Quiet, watchful, the kind of boy who observed more than he spoke. He wasn't easy to read, but I learned him the way you learn a language that isn't taught in any classroom, through years of patient listening. I knew when something was wrong before he said a word. I knew his silences the way musicians know rests in a piece of music. Not as absence, but as meaning. I sacrifice things I don't talk about often because talking about sacrifice can start to sound like you're keeping score, and that was never my intention. I didn't buy myself new clothes for 4 years straight so Marcus could have the graphing calculator his math teacher said he needed. I didn't take a single vacation during his entire high school career because every spare dollar went into the account I called, privately, his future fund. I skipped my own dentist appointments. I drove a car with a cracked windshield for 2 winters because the repair cost would have eaten into his college savings. None of that felt like sacrifice at the time. Felt like love. That's the thing about love when it's real. It doesn't announce itself as noble. It just does what it does, quietly, without ceremony. Marcus got into Ohio State. I cried in the parking lot of the grocery store when the acceptance letter came. Alone in my old Buick, with a bag of reduced-price chicken thighs in the back seat. I cried the kind of tears that don't have a name in English. Tears that are grief and pride and exhaustion and relief all at once. He studied business. He was sharp, focused, and driven in ways that I recognized as mine but expressed in ways that were entirely his own. After graduation he moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, for a corporate job. He met a woman named Vanessa. They married in 2019 in a ceremony at a vineyard outside of Asheville that cost more money than I made in 2 years. And I sat in the front row in a dress I had altered 3 times to get right, and I felt something I can only describe as complete. I thought we had made it. Both of us. I moved to Charlotte in 2022 to be closer to him. To them. I rented a small apartment on Sardis Road, 12 minutes from their house. Close enough to matter. Far enough to give them space. I was careful about that. I never dropped by unannounced. I never asked for more than I was given. I should have noticed sooner that what I was being given was growing smaller. But I didn't. Or maybe I did and I just kept choosing not to see it. The changes didn't come all at once. That's the thing about being slowly pushed to the edges of someone's life. It doesn't feel like a shove. Feels like a gentle, almost imperceptible drift. Like standing in the ocean and not realizing the current has moved you until you look up and the shore is somewhere you don't recognize anymore. It started with the Sunday dinners. When I first moved to Charlotte, Marcus and Vanessa had me over most Sundays. Nothing elaborate. Sometimes just pasta, sometimes grilled chicken, a salad from a bag. But we sat together at their dining room table, the one with the dark walnut finish that I had helped them pick out at a furniture store on South Boulevard. Talk. Marcus would tell me about work, about the accounts he was managing, about the office politics that frustrated him. Vanessa would talk about her interior design projects, the clients who changed their minds 3 times before settling on the first idea. I listened more than I talked because listening was what I did best, and because being in that room with them felt like enough. Then, sometime in the spring of 2023, the Sunday dinners became every other Sunday. Marcus explained it reasonably. They were busy, they had their own social lives, they needed their weekends. Understood. Said so. Meant it. By late 2024, the dinners had become once a month, and then less than that. When I did come over, there was something different in the air. Not unfriendly exactly. More like, managed. Like I was a scheduled appointment rather than a mother. Vanessa would greet me at the door with a smile that started and stopped at her lips. Marcus would hug me briefly. The kind of hug that communicates obligation rather than warmth. We would eat quickly. The conversation was surface level, careful. Like everyone was avoiding something without agreeing in advance to avoid it. I started to notice other things. When I called Marcus during the week, he rarely picked up. He would text back hours later, sometimes the next day, with short responses. Busy, Mom. Talk soon. Soon was a word he used often and meant rarely. When I mentioned I hadn't been feeling well one January afternoon in 2025, a passing comment about a persistent cough that had been troubling me, he said, "You should see a doctor," and then pivoted immediately to something about a work trip he was taking to Denver. Not a follow-up question. Not a call the next day to check in. I sat with that for a long time. I want to be honest with you about something because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling. I blamed myself first. That's what mothers do, especially mothers of my generation. Mothers who were raised to believe that keeping the peace was a form of love. I turned myself over like a stone and examined every surface. Had I said something wrong? Had I overstepped? Was I calling too often, needing too much, being too present in some way I wasn't aware of? I adjusted accordingly. Called less. Asked for less. I made myself smaller and quieter and easier to accommodate. And still the distance grew. Vanessa had a group of friends, women she had grown up with in Raleigh, sorority sisters, colleagues from her early career. They were a particular kind of woman, polished and coordinated in the way that suggested both money and effort. I had met several of them at the wedding and at a few gatherings since. They were not unkind to me, but they related to me the way people relate to something they don't quite know how to categorize. Polite. Slightly formal. As though I were a piece of furniture that didn't quite match the rest of the room. I noticed that when Vanessa spoke about family, she spoke almost exclusively about her own. Her parents in Raleigh, her sister in Atlanta, her cousins who gathered every Thanksgiving at a lake house in Highlands. Marcus had folded himself into that world completely. And somewhere in that folding I had been left outside the crease. I told myself it was normal. Couples build their own lives. Children pull away. This is what growing up looks like from the other side. But there was a weight to it that I couldn't name then. Sitting alone in my apartment on Sardis Road on the Sunday evenings when I was no longer invited anywhere, eating whatever I had made for myself, watching the light change outside my window. A weight that was about to have a name. The party was Vanessa's idea. That much I knew from the beginning. Marcus called me on a Tuesday evening in late March of 2025 to tell me about it. His voice had that particular brightness it got when he was delivering information he had rehearsed slightly in advance. He told me that he and Vanessa were hosting a dinner party at their home on the second Saturday of April. A celebration, he said. He had just been promoted to regional vice president at his firm, and they wanted to mark the occasion with close friends and colleagues. I felt genuine pride move through me when he said the words regional vice president. I thought about that 5:15 bus. I thought about the cracked windshield. I thought about the acceptance letter and the parking lot and the reduced-price chicken thighs. I told him I was so proud of him, and I meant every syllable. He thanked me, and then there was a brief pause, the kind of pause I had learned over 67 years to pay attention to, before he said, "We'd love for you to come, Mom." I said of course. I said I wouldn't miss it. He said great, and then, in the same casual tone a person uses to mention what they're having for lunch, he said, "We're seating the main guests in the dining room and the living room, so we thought maybe you could be comfortable in the kitchen. There's a little breakfast nook back there, and you'd still be part of everything." I didn't say anything for a moment. "The kitchen," said. "It's a nice space," he said. "You know the layout. It's open. You'd be able to hear everything." I want to tell you what happened inside me in that moment because I think it matters. I want to tell you it was rage or shock or the sharp clarity of sudden understanding. But it wasn't any of those things, not right away. What it was first was a kind of stillness. The way the air goes very quiet right before something large happens. I said, "Okay, Marcus. I'll be there." And I hung up the phone and sat in my armchair by the window and looked out at the parking lot below my apartment and watched a man walk his dog in the early spring dark. And I breathed very slowly, the way I had learned to breathe through pain over a lifetime of practicing it. The kitchen. I turned the word over in my mind the way you turn a stone you found on a path, not sure yet whether it's ordinary or worth keeping. The kitchen. Not the dining room where the colleagues would sit. Not the living room where the close friends would gather. The kitchen. The breakfast nook. Where I would be able to hear everything without being seen as part of anything. I have spent a great deal of my life in kitchens. I cooked in the kitchen of our apartment on Livingston Avenue when Marcus was small, stretching a pound of ground beef into 3 different meals because that was what the budget required. I cooked in the kitchens of the patients I cared for, warming soup and cutting toast into triangles because small dignities matter when the larger ones have been taken away by illness. I knew kitchens. I had nothing against kitchens. But I understood, with the quiet certainty of a woman who has lived long enough to know the difference between an oversight and a decision, that this was not about the kitchen. This was about where I fit in the story Marcus and Vanessa were telling about themselves. And in that story, I was not a guest of honor. I was not even a guest. I was something to be managed, accommodated, placed somewhere convenient and out of the way, close enough to say I had been included, far enough to ensure I didn't complicate the picture. I didn't sleep well that night. But I didn't cry either. I lay in the dark of my bedroom and I thought about a woman I had once cared for in Columbus. A 91-year-old named Estelle who had outlived 2 husbands and one of her children, and who had a way of looking at difficult things directly, without flinching, that I had always admired. Estelle used to say, "Dorothy, the truth doesn't get easier if you look away from it. It just gets bigger." I looked at the truth that night. And it was bigger than I had been allowing myself to admit. The 2 weeks between that phone call and the party were quiet ones. Outwardly, nothing changed. I went to my water aerobics class at the YMCA on Monday and Wednesday mornings. I had lunch with my friend Carolyn at the Panera on Park Road on the following Thursday, and I let her talk about her grandchildren and her garden and her ongoing dispute with her homeowners association, and I listened the way I always listened, fully without rushing her toward a point. I did my grocery shopping. I read in the evenings. I watered my plants. But inwardly, something had shifted. Something quiet and fundamental, the way a foundation shifts, not visible from the outside but altering everything that rests upon it. I found myself thinking about my mother. Her name was Ruth, and she raised 6 children in a small house in Dayton, Ohio, on a street that no longer exists because they built a highway through it in the 1970s. She was a woman of few words and enormous endurance. The kind of woman who expressed love through presence and labor rather than language. She made biscuits from scratch every Sunday morning. She pressed our clothes the night before school with an attention to detail that suggested she believed a neat collar could protect a child from the world's indifference. She was not a woman who asked for much. And I remember very clearly the way certain people treated her as she got older. The way her opinions were smiled at rather than considered. The way conversations moved around her rather than including her. The way her presence was acknowledged the way you acknowledge furniture. Noted but not engaged with. She accepted it. She was of a generation that accepted such things, that understood endurance as the primary virtue available to women like her. I had always told myself I would not accept it. Sitting in my apartment in those 2 weeks before the party, I began to do something I had not done in many years. I began to take inventory. Not an emotional inventory, not yet. Practical one. I have a savings account at Wells Fargo that contains, as of April 2025, a little over $43,000. I built that account slowly over decades, the way you build anything without much. Carefully, consistently, without ever touching it unless there was no other choice. I also have a certificate of deposit that matures in August, and a small but respectable retirement account from my years working through a home health agency that offered benefits. 3 years ago, when Marcus and Vanessa were purchasing their home, a 4-bedroom colonial on Knotty Pine Drive in the Ballantine area of Charlotte, they had come to me during the closing process. The down payment was significant, and they were $11,000 short of what they needed to avoid a higher interest rate on the mortgage. Marcus had asked me, quietly and somewhat awkwardly, the way people ask for money when they are not accustomed to needing it, whether I might be able to help. I gave them the $11,000 without hesitation. I did not ask for a repayment timeline. I did not draw up any paperwork. I gave it the way I gave most things to Marcus. Openly, without conditions, because that was what love looked like to me. That money was never repaid. And I had never mentioned it. I sat at my kitchen table, my own kitchen table in my own small apartment, and I looked at the numbers in my bank application on my phone, and I thought about that $11,000, and I thought about the breakfast nook, and I thought about Estelle, and I thought about my mother pressing collars in the dark of an Ohio evening so her children could walk into the world looking like they were worth something. And I made a decision. Not a dramatic one. Not one that involved confrontation or accusation or any of the loud machinery of grievance. Quiet one. I decided to go to the party. I want you to understand why, because it might seem at first like weakness or like hope, like I was holding on to some possibility that things might be different than they appeared. But it wasn't either of those things. I had moved through hope and out the other side. What I had now was something steadier. I was going because I needed to see it clearly. I had spent 2 weeks sitting with the idea of the kitchen, turning it over, examining it from every angle, and a part of me, the part that had loved Marcus for his entire life with a love that was not reasonable or measured but absolute, wanted to give that idea one more chance to be something other than what it looked like. I ironed my best blouse. The navy one with the small pearl buttons that I had bought at Belk 2 years ago and saved for occasions that felt important. I did my hair the way I did it when I wanted to feel like myself. Pulled back neatly with the silver showing, because I had stopped being ashamed of the silver a long time ago. I drove to Knotty Pine Drive on a Saturday evening in April, and I parked in front of the house I had helped buy. And I sat in my car for a moment, and I breathed. Then I walked to the door and I rang the bell. Vanessa answered the door. She was wearing a cream-colored wrap dress, and her hair was done in the kind of effortless waves that actually require considerable effort. And she smelled like something expensive and floral. She smiled when she saw me, that same managed smile, starting and stopping at the right places, and said, "Dorothy, you made it. Come in." Not Mom. Not even Mrs. Calloway. Dorothy. She had called me Dorothy since the wedding, and I had never corrected her, because I had told myself it was a generational thing, a regional thing, a nothing thing. Standing in that doorway in my navy blouse, I noted it again and said nothing again and stepped inside. The house was full of people and light, and the particular energy of a gathering that has been carefully curated. I could see immediately, in the way you see things when you have finally allowed yourself to see clearly, that this was not a small dinner among close friends. There were perhaps 30 people arranged across the living room and dining room. Men in blazers, women in cocktail dresses, the ambient sound of professional laughter and wine glasses, and the kind of conversation that is as much performance as communication. A catering company had set up a buffet along the dining room wall. There were flowers on every surface, white and green arrangements that I recognized as the kind Vanessa favored. Soft jazz played from somewhere. The dining room table, the walnut one I had helped choose, was set with linen napkins and candles and the good dishes they had received as wedding gifts. I stood in the entryway and took all of it in. Marcus appeared from across the room. He was wearing a dark gray suit and he looked well, prosperous and confident and at ease in the way that people look when they are exactly where they imagine themselves being. He hugged me briefly, hand on my shoulder, the obligatory hug, and said, "Mom, glad you came. Let me get you settled. Let me get you settled." He walked me through the living room, past the colleagues and the friends and the careful arrangements, and through the doorway into the kitchen. It was a large kitchen, I will give it that. Granite countertops, stainless appliances, the kind of kitchen that appears in home design magazines. And in the corner, tucked beside the window that overlooked the backyard, was the breakfast nook. Small table, 2 chairs, a little vase with a single stem of something white. Someone had made an effort. That was almost worse somehow. The single stem, the careful placement, the performance of consideration without the substance of it. "There's plenty of food," Marcus said, gesturing toward the counter where some of the catering overflow had been placed. "And we'll come check on you. We'll come check on you." As though I were a patient. As though I were one of the elderly people I had spent my career caring for. Someone to be looked in on between the important activities of the day. He was already turning back toward the living room when he said it. Already moving away. I stood in the kitchen of the house I helped buy and I looked at the breakfast nook and the single white stem and I listened to the sound of the party happening in the other rooms. The laughter, the clinking, the music, the hum of people who mattered being among people who mattered. And I felt something move through me. Not rage. I want to be clear about that. Rage would have been easier in some ways. Rage has momentum. Rage tells you what to do next. What I felt was quieter and more total than rage. It was the feeling of something ending. Not breaking, ending. The way a long piece of music ends, not with a crash but with a note that simply stops, and then there is silence, and the silence is its own kind of statement. I stood there for perhaps 90 seconds. I looked at the chair I was meant to sit in. I looked at the doorway Marcus had just walked back through. I set my purse on the counter, not the table, the counter, because I was not sitting down. And I stood very still for a moment in the way I had learned to stand still when something required my full attention. And then I picked my purse back up. I walked back through the kitchen doorway, through the living room where no one particularly noticed me, past the dining room table with its linen napkins and candles, and I opened the front door of the house on Knotty Pine Drive, and I walked out. I did not say goodbye. I did not make a scene. I did not stop to explain myself to anyone. I simply left, the way you leave a place when you have understood finally and completely that you were never really meant to be there. I walked to my car. I sat down. I placed my hands on the steering wheel. And I drove home. I slept better that night than I had in months. That surprised me. I had expected to lie awake in the particular anguish of the thing that had just happened, turning it over and over the way you press a bruise to confirm it's real. I had expected the ceiling of my bedroom to become a screen for every memory I didn't want to watch. But instead I fell asleep quickly and deeply, and I didn't dream. And when I woke up on Sunday morning, the light coming through my curtains was the pale gold of early spring, and the apartment was very quiet, and I lay there for a moment just breathing. There is something clarifying about a decision that has finally been made. I made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table. My table in my kitchen, where I was neither a guest nor an afterthought but simply myself. And I drank it slowly and I watched the birds at the feeder I had hung outside my window the previous fall. A pair of Carolina wrens. House finch. The ordinary beautiful business of small creatures living their lives. My phone had notifications. 3 missed calls from Marcus, starting at 9:47 the previous evening. A text that said, "Mom, where did you go? We looked for you." Another that said, "Call me when you get this." And one from Vanessa, which surprised me slightly, that said simply, "Dorothy, is everything okay?" I read them all. I set the phone face down on the table. I watched the Finch for a while longer. I was not ready to respond. Not because I was punishing anyone, I want to be precise about that, because the line between dignity and cruelty matters to me and I have always tried to stay on the right side of it. I was not ready to respond because I had not yet decided what I wanted to say. And I had learned over 67 years that speaking before you know what you mean is how you give away the only advantage a quiet person has. So I waited. I called Carolyn on Sunday afternoon. Carolyn is 71. A retired high school principal from Concord, who has the particular no-nonsense warmth of a woman who has spent decades managing other people's children and has therefore developed an efficient and unsentimental relationship with the truth. She is my closest friend in Charlotte, the person I trust most in the city, and I told her what had happened. The phone call, the kitchen, the breakfast nook, the single white stem, the 90 seconds of standing there, the leaving. She was quiet for a moment when I finished. Then she said, "Good." Just that. Good. And I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. We talked for a long time after that. Not about Marcus or Vanessa or the party specifically, but about the larger thing. About what it means to reach a certain point in your life and realize that you have been making yourself smaller for so long that you have forgotten what your full size actually is. About the particular loneliness of being a mother whose child has grown into someone she doesn't entirely recognize. About the difference between loving someone and accepting any treatment from them in the name of that love. Carolyn said something I wrote down after we hung up because I wanted to keep it. She said, "Dorothy, you spent 40 years making sure Marcus knew he was worth something. It's time to spend some time remembering that you are too." I wrote it on a notepad and put it on my refrigerator door with a magnet shaped like the state of Ohio that I had kept for years, through every move, through every new kitchen. Still there. On Monday morning I called my attorney. Her name is Patricia Osei, and she has an office on Fairview Road in the South Park area of Charlotte. I had used her 3 years ago for some estate planning. A will, a healthcare directive, the basic documents that responsible adults put in order and then try not to think about too much. She is thorough and direct, and she does not waste either her time or yours, which are qualities I respect enormously. I made an appointment for Wednesday afternoon. I did not call Marcus back on Sunday, or Monday, or Tuesday. On Wednesday morning before my appointment, I sent him a single text message. It said, "I'm fine. I'll be in touch when I'm ready." I imagine that landed with a certain weight. I hoped it did. Not because I wanted him to suffer. I have never wanted that, not even in the worst of what I was feeling, but because I wanted him to understand that something had changed. That the woman who would have called back within the hour, who would have smoothed things over and made it easy and found a way to reassure him that everything was fine, that woman had walked out of a kitchen on Knotty Pine Drive on a Saturday night in April and had not come back. I drove to Patricia's office on Wednesday afternoon in the mild Charlotte spring, parked in the deck on Barclay Downs Drive, and rode the elevator up with my folder of documents and my list of questions and the steady, unhurried sense of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing and why. Patricia Osei's office had the kind of quiet that good professional spaces have. Not empty quiet, but ordered quiet, the kind that suggests the people inside are doing serious work and taking it seriously. There were framed degrees on the wall, a row of green plants along the windowsill that looked genuinely cared for, and a view of the South Park skyline that on a clear April afternoon was actually quite lovely. She came out to greet me herself, which I appreciated. A firm handshake, direct eye contact, the reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck catching the light as she moved. She was perhaps 50, Ghanaian American, with a manner that was warm but economical. She gave you her full attention without any of the performance of it. We sat down and I told her everything. I told her about the $11,000. I told her about the house on Knotty Pine Drive, the mortgage they had needed help with, the money I had given without documentation, without a repayment agreement, without anything in writing because I had been operating from love rather than prudence and because I had never imagined I would need to protect myself from my own son. I told her about the distance that had grown over the past 2 years, the managed visits, the brief hugs, the unanswered calls. I told her about the phone call in March and the breakfast nook and the single white stem and the 90 seconds. I told her about walking out. Patricia listened without interrupting. She made notes. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she asked me several precise and practical questions. About the nature of the transfer, whether I had any bank records showing the withdrawal, whether there had been any communication, written or otherwise, about the $11,000 being a loan versus a gift. I had my bank statement from 3 years ago in my folder. I had thought to bring it, which Patricia noted with what I recognized as professional approval. The distinction between a gift and a loan matters enormously, she said, and without documentation it becomes difficult to establish. However, she continued, setting her pen down and looking at me directly, the more immediately actionable question is what you want to accomplish going forward. Not just legally, but in terms of your own life and security. That was the right question. That was exactly the right question. I had spent the 4 days since the party thinking about it, and I had arrived at Patricia's office not with grievances but with intentions. There is an important difference between those two things, and I think it is the difference that determines whether a person emerges from a painful situation with their dignity intact or spends the rest of their life defined by what was done to them. I told her what I wanted. First, I wanted my will revised. When I had drawn it up 3 years ago, Marcus was the sole beneficiary of my estate. The savings account, the certificate of deposit, the retirement account, the small collection of things I owned that had value beyond sentiment. I wanted that changed. Not entirely, not vindicatively, but thoughtfully. I told Patricia about Carolyn's daughter, a young woman named Simone who was working her way through nursing school at UNC Charlotte while raising a toddler on her own. I told her about my church, St. Andrew's Baptist on Rama Road, which had a community outreach program that fed families in the university area every Saturday morning. I told her about my niece, Gloria, who lived in Memphis and had always shown me the kind of consistent, unasked, for kindness that tends to go unnoticed precisely because it never demands to be noticed. Patricia wrote it all down. Second, I told her I wanted a formal promissory note drawn up for the $11,000. Not because I expected to collect it. I was realistic about what that process would look like and what it would cost in ways that had nothing to do with money, but because I wanted the transaction documented. I wanted it to exist in the record as what it actually was, which was a loan extended in good faith by a mother who believed good faith was the language her family spoke. Third, and this was the one that had taken me the longest to arrive at, the one I had turned over most carefully in the days since Saturday, I told her I was considering moving. Not far. Not out of Charlotte necessarily, though I had let my mind travel in that direction once or twice. But out of the apartment on Sardis Road, 12 minutes from Knotty Pine Drive, which I had chosen specifically for its proximity to a son who had placed me in a breakfast nook and walked away. The proximity no longer served any purpose I recognized. Patricia nodded slowly. Any of these steps, she said, can be taken independently and in whatever order makes sense to you. None of them require Marcus's knowledge or involvement. I appreciated that she said it plainly. I know, I said. That's rather the point. She smiled then, a real one, brief and genuine, and picked her pen back up and we got to work. The will took 10 days to revise and execute. I went back to Patricia's office on a Thursday morning in late April, and signed the new documents with the careful attention I gave to anything that mattered. Patricia's assistant, a young man named Derek who had kind eyes and moved through the office with quiet efficiency, notarized each page. I drove home afterward feeling something I can only describe as structural, like a beam that had been slightly out of alignment had been set right, and the whole building was the better for it without anyone being able to point to exactly what had changed. Marcus had called 3 more times in the days after my text message. He had not left voicemails, which told me something. A person who is genuinely worried leaves a voicemail. A person who wants to manage a situation calls and waits to see which version of you picks up. I did not pick up. I was not ready, and more importantly, I was no longer in the habit of making myself ready on someone else's timeline. Vanessa had sent one more text. It said, "Marcus is worried. We both are. Please reach out when you can." I noted the way it was deployed like a shield, the way it transformed a bilateral concern into something that sounded more official than it felt. I was not unmoved by the worry. I want to say that clearly because I think it would be easier, cleaner narratively, if I had arrived at some cool and total indifference to my son's feelings. But that is not what happened. I still loved Marcus. I loved him with a particular helpless permanence of a mother's love, which does not negotiate and does not expire and does not care very much whether it is being treated well. That love was not in question. What was in question was what I was willing to accept in its name. I began looking at apartments in the third week of April. A friend from my water aerobics class, a woman named Beverly who had lived in Charlotte for 30 years, mentioned that there was a senior living community in the Dilworth neighborhood called Elmwood Gardens that was not what people pictured when they heard senior living. No institutional hallways, no cafeteria smell. It was a collection of independent living apartments built around a central courtyard with mature trees and a small garden that residents could tend if they chose. The apartments were 1 and 2 bedrooms, well appointed, with full kitchens and large windows. The community had a library, a fitness room, a monthly lecture series. I visited on a Tuesday morning. The woman who showed me around was named Karen, and she was the right kind of salesperson. Honest about limitations, enthusiastic about genuine strengths, not pushy. The apartment she showed me was on the 2nd floor, facing the courtyard. The light came in from the east in the morning, which I have always preferred. There was a window above the kitchen sink that looked out onto a dogwood tree that was, in late April, in full bloom. White flowers against a sky so blue it looked painted. I stood at that window for a long moment. I thought about the window above the sink in every kitchen I had ever stood in. The apartment on Livingston Avenue in Columbus, where the window looked onto a brick wall and I had hung a small print of a landscape to give my eyes somewhere else to go. The various houses and apartments of patients I had cared for over the years, different windows, different views, the same essential act of looking outward while the hands did their quiet work. The kitchen on Knotty Pine Drive, the large bright one with the granite counters, and the breakfast nook in the corner with a single white stem. I turned away from the window and looked at the apartment around me. It was smaller than I might have chosen in another moment of my life. But it was entirely, uncomplicatedly mine. No proximity calculated to suit someone else's convenience. No 12-minute radius maintained out of a hope I was no longer holding. Just a good room with good light and a dogwood tree outside the window, and enough space for my books and my plants and the notepad on the refrigerator door with Carolyn's words on it. I told Karen I would think about it because I was not a person who made large decisions without sitting with them, and then I drove home and I sat with it for 4 days, and on Saturday morning, exactly 2 weeks after the party, 2 weeks after I had walked out of a kitchen on Knotty Pine Drive without saying a word, I called Karen back and told her I would take it. The 1st of June was the move-in date. I hung up the phone and sat quietly for a moment in my apartment on Sardis Road, looking around at the accumulated texture of a life, the books on the shelves, the photographs on the side table, the Ohio magnet on the refrigerator, and I felt, moving through me slowly and steadily like warm water, something that it took me a moment to identify. It was relief. Not the sharp relief of a crisis resolved, but the deep, settling relief of a woman who has finally stopped waiting to be chosen and has begun, deliberately and with full awareness, to choose herself. Marcus came to my apartment on a Sunday afternoon in early May. He didn't call first. That was new. In all the years I had lived in Charlotte, in all the Sunday dinners and occasional visits and carefully managed proximity, Marcus had always called ahead. It was one of the protocols of our relationship that I had understood without either of us naming it. He announced himself, I prepared myself, we met in the middle of whatever we were to each other in any given season. He knocked on my door at 2:17 in the afternoon while I was repotting a peace lily on my kitchen table, my hands in the soil, the Sunday afternoon quiet around me like something I had earned. I washed my hands and dried them slowly and went to the door. He looked tired. That was the first thing I noticed. The prosperity and ease I had seen on his face at the party 3 weeks earlier had settled into something more complicated, There were shadows under his eyes and a tension in the set of his jaw that I recognized from his childhood, from the way he looked when something was troubling him that he didn't know how to approach. I noticed all of this the way a mother notices things. Automatically, completely, with a love that doesn't pause to ask whether it's warranted. "Mom," he said. "Marcus," I said. "Come in." He sat at my kitchen table, in the chair across from where the peace lily sat half repotted in its new soil, and I made coffee without asking whether he wanted it because that was what I did and some habits are worth keeping. I set a cup in front of him and sat down across from him and waited. He talked for a long time. He started with the party, with the fact that they had noticed I was gone, with the confusion and then the concern, with Vanessa's anxiety and his own. He said he had called and texted and I hadn't responded and he hadn't known what to think. His voice had the quality of a man who has been carrying something and is relieved to be setting it down, and I let him set it down without interrupting. Then he got to the part that I had been waiting for, that I had known was coming because I knew him, I had always known him, the part where he tried to explain the kitchen. He said they had seated guests according to the formality of their relationship to the occasion. Colleagues and professional contacts in the dining room and living room, family in a more comfortable and informal space. He said he had thought I would be more comfortable away from the professional atmosphere. He said Vanessa had thought it would be less overwhelming for me. He said it carefully, in the language of reason, and I sat across from him and I listened to every word. When he finished, I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Marcus, do you remember the winter your senior year of high school when the heat went out in our apartment for 11 days? He looked slightly caught off guard by the question. "Yes," he said slowly. "Do you remember what I did?" He thought about it. "You got space heaters," he said. "I got 2 space heaters from the Salvation Army on Cleveland Avenue," I said. "And I put them both in your room so you could sleep warm and study warm, and I slept in the living room in my coat. For 11 days. Do you remember that?" He was looking at me in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. Something open in his face that the years and the success and the curated life had layered over. "I didn't know that," he said quietly. "No," I said. "You weren't meant to. You were 17 and you had finals and there was no reason for you to carry that." Pause. "I am telling you now not to make you feel guilty, Marcus. I'm telling you because I need you to understand something about who I am and who I have always been. I am not a woman who belongs in the corner of a room. I am not a woman to be managed and accommodated and checked on. I am your mother. I am the reason you were warm that winter. And I deserved a seat at your table." The kitchen was very quiet. Marcus put his hands around his coffee cup and looked down at them, and I watched something move across his face that I recognized as genuine. Not performed, not managed, but real. His eyes were bright in the way that precedes tears in people who are not accustomed to crying. "I didn't think about it that way," he said. And then, more quietly, "I didn't think." "No," I said, gently but without softening it beyond what was true. "You didn't." We sat together in the quiet of that for a moment, the peace lily between us in its fresh soil, the Sunday afternoon light moving slowly across the kitchen floor, and I let the silence be what it was. Not comfortable exactly, but honest, which is sometimes more valuable than comfort. Then I told him I was moving. He didn't argue. That surprised me, in the way that people sometimes surprise you by rising to a moment you weren't sure they were capable of meeting. I told him about Elmwood Gardens. I told him about the second-floor apartment, the eastern light, the dogwood tree outside the kitchen window. I told him the 1st of June was the move-in date, and that I had already begun packing the things that mattered most, which was not very many things, because I had learned over 67 years that the objects worth keeping are fewer than you think and lighter than you fear. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Is there anything I can do to help you move?" It was a small sentence. It was not an apology, not a reckoning, Not the kind of dramatic moment that resolves everything in a single conversation and makes the preceding pain feel tidy and purposeful. Life does not generally offer those moments, and I have always been suspicious of people who claim to have experienced them. But it was a real sentence, an offered hand, and I had not come this far by refusing genuine things. Told him yes. I told him I could use help with the larger boxes, with a bookshelf that had always been difficult to move, with a peace lily that needed careful handling. He nodded and took out his phone and put the 1st of June in his calendar, and I watched him do it, and I felt something complex and layered move through me. Grief and love and the particular bittersweetness of a relationship finding a new shape after the old one has broken. I also told him before he left that afternoon about the $11,000. I told him calmly and without accusation, laying it out the way Patricia had helped me think about it. As information, as history, as something that existed in the record whether or not we had ever named it. I told him that Patricia had prepared documentation and that I was not demanding immediate repayment, but that I wanted it acknowledged. I wanted it to exist between us as what it was. He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "I'll talk to Vanessa. We'll figure out a repayment plan." He nodded. I did not thank him for it because it was not a gift. It was a return. But I acknowledged it and I moved on because that is what you do with things that have been set right. You do not stand over them. You move on. He hugged me at the door when he left. A different hug than the obligatory ones. Longer, less managed. The hug of a man who is remembering something important about who he is and where he comes from. I let myself receive it fully, without protecting myself from it, because I was not at war with my son. I was simply no longer willing to lose myself in the effort of keeping the peace. He said, "I'm sorry, Mom." I said, "I know." And I meant both things. I know that you're sorry, and I know what it cost you to say it, and I know that sorry is a beginning and not an ending, and I know that we have work to do, and I know that I love you in the way that doesn't negotiate. And I know that knowing all of this does not mean I will ever again sit in a breakfast nook while my son's colleagues occupy the table I helped him buy. I didn't say all of that. I just said I know. But it contained all of those things, and I think he heard at least some of them. I moved into Elmwood Gardens on the 1st of June, on a warm Saturday morning when the dogwood outside my new kitchen window had finished blooming and put out its summer leaves. Deep green and steady. The kind of quiet permanence that asks for nothing and simply continues. Marcus came with a friend from his office, a broad-shouldered young man named Terence who carried boxes without complaint and made me laugh twice with a dry humor that reminded me unexpectedly of Marcus at 19. We moved everything in 4 hours. Vanessa did not come, and I did not expect her to, and that was fine. Some distances close slowly. Some may not close entirely. I had made my peace with the full range of possibilities. When the last box was inside and Terence had gone to return the rented dolly, Marcus stood in the middle of my new living room and looked around at the beginning of the space I was making for myself. The books finding their shelves, the Ohio magnet already on the refrigerator door, the peace lily in the corner by the window where the morning light would reach it. He said, "It's a good place, Mom." I stood beside him and looked at it too. "Yes," I said. "It is." After he left I made myself a cup of coffee and I carried it to the window and I stood there in my own kitchen, in my own space, 12 minutes from no one in particular and exactly as close to myself as I had always deserved to be. The evening light came in long and golden across the floor. A Carolina wren landed in the dogwood tree outside, considered the branch for a moment, and then sang, brief, clear, completely itself. I drank my coffee. I was, at 67 years old in the spring of 2025, in a city I had chosen, in a home I had chosen, beginning, quietly, without ceremony, without anyone's permission, the next chapter of my life. And it was enough. More than enough. It was mine.